Hello. How are you? Hello, Fraser.
Stop meeting like this.
Say again?
It's our third panel together.
Oh, we're done with you. You going to say anything different? I'm not.
No, I think we've both heard each other's lines.
I'll try not to use any of yours.
Thank you. There you go. Right. Thank you all for coming to this Centre for Policy Studies panel, Escaping the Welfare Trap. Joining us today we have the Right Honourable Baroness Coffey, who was MP from 2010 till 2024, and amongst her various senior governmental positions was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. And we have Helen Whately, MP for Faversham and Mid-Kent since 2017, served in various ministerial roles, and is now Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Then we have Fraser Nelson, Times columnist, former editor for The Spectator, and I expect almost everyone in this room has seen his TV documentary on Britain's benefits scandal. And then we have Jimmy McLaughlin, who is the host of the Jobs of the Future podcast, former special advisor in government, including in 2016 to 2019, when he was the Prime Minister's Director of Business at number 10 Downing Street. So, Britain's welfare trap. We have 9.4 million people economically inactive. We have 5,000 people a day signing on to sickness benefits. And according to the OBR, by the end of this Parliament, working age welfare spending is going to stand at about £75 billion, 50% higher than it is now. So my first question to the panellists is going to be, what exactly is driving these extraordinary numbers? Therese, could you give us your thoughts?
Well, Fraser is the person who's been doing a lot about data and where different drivers are, and Helen has done some brilliant work, which Mel announced yesterday, but there is a real opportunity to save money on welfare, but it's going to take a lot of drilling down and determination to put in place the changes. And one of the things, it's not anything new, but look, a decade ago, or just over a decade ago, when IDS introduced universal credit, it was always designed to be more generous than the actual existing benefit system. However, the main difference about UC was supposed to be that it removed that cliff edge that you should be better off, and you are better off working on universal credit than if you're not. So going back to that whole mantra is, if you can work, you should work. And if you can't work, that's when we will help you. And where we've seen a significant increase has been well documented, including by Fraser and others, about the expansion, and particularly of the higher levels of disability payments being issued for people with poor mental health. And I think there's a number of factors in this where I remember at the time, and Debbie Stebbins-Scott is in the audience, she was the key minister for me in DWP. She'd had 30 years of experience of getting people into work, so it was the perfect place for her to be. But when I was talking about how can we link perhaps people getting treated to in order to improve their mental well-being, I was told it got this legal analysis, it was against their human rights and we couldn't do this, that and the other. So then that's when actually DWP became one of the biggest purchasers of mental health services through some of its programs, because we couldn't rely on the NHS. And for what it's worth, I've long thought if the NHS had to pay for all the health benefits, the NHS would be more interested in getting people better. At the moment, they resent being a gateway to benefits as they see it, and that has led to a number of consequences. But on a wider thing, I remember having a chat with Helen when she first took on the portfolio, and as part of the renewal, she wanted to get into the diagnosis of why is it that people have become so dependent on benefits, or such a high proportion of our country. And we finally removed tax credits. Labour had designed tax credits deliberately, didn't call it a benefit, but they designed it to help a certain category of family. But as a consequence of their poor design, it actually meant thousands of employers redesign their jobs, because you'd have to be insane if you were on tax credits to work for a minute over 16 hours a week. So that has finally gone. But what I have noticed since Labour has come to power, they're very happy to spread around money, especially if it's not theirs, but like energy, warm home discounts, spreading it to everybody on universal credit. By the way, the impact of that is that the most fuel poor will now get a lower rebate than before. They have extended free school meals to everybody, and they have put up the basic rate of universal credit. They estimate it is going to cost them an extra £2 billion a year by the end of this decade. In their impact assessment, they'd already underestimated how many people are actually on universal credit now. So it's going to cost more. And I don't know if they have done this deliberately or if they're just thick. I think both could well be true. But they have made it more and more reasons why not to come off benefits. And we're seeing that in other ways in terms of practices and job centres as well. So I think going further, and Helen has made a wonderful start and significant savings, we're going to have to go drill into the detail even more to undo some of Labour's mess that has created this dependency. And by the way, there are now 220,000 households still receiving universal credit with a household income of over £35,000. So that just shows you that they are spreading out money and giving very little reasons for people to actually work more and contribute to the growth of our economy. And that is something that I think we will have to unravel when we get back into power in 2029.
Helen, how much of that diagnosis do you agree with?
A lot. I mean, one of the things that's enormous help to me in the policy work that I'm doing as Shadow Secretary of State is the fact that we have people like Therese who have experience of being in government and in charge of it, and who know some of the challenges in fixing it and have got a wealth of experience that I've been able to draw on. So thank you, Therese, for that. And I spend a lot of my time as well going around the country to understand what's really going on, because I think there are rarely simple answers to complex problems. You have to understand not only the data, but actually the sort of the human side of the situation. However, I will try and come up with a synthesis to answer your initial question and talk briefly about incentives, support and jobs as a way into it. And I think the number one problem is that we're in a situation where the incentives are stacked against people working. When we were in government, when we came in 2010 through to the pandemic, a huge amount of work was done with sort of Ian Duncan Smith at the helm of introducing universal credit and making sure that work would always pay, and that was part of bringing down the benefits bill and unemployment came down through that time. But what we've then seen is an increase in the number of people claiming sickness benefits, particularly driven by a rise in claims for mental health. And it has become too easy to get benefits for people who actually could and should be working, particularly if you've got a common mental health challenge, relatively mild, low level, things I'm talking about, whether it's anxiety or people receiving benefits with ADHD. And I say that as somebody who has been a campaigner on mental health and improving mental health care for people with serious mental illness. But the fact is the way the sickness benefit system, the PIP system particularly, is working, where it's no longer face-to-face assessments for a large share of people who want to claim benefits. So it's over the phone, and the bar is just not in the right place, and people are far too often claiming for those things instead of getting support for whatever the issue is that's triggered them to think that they need benefits rather than working. And the reality is, and that it is well known, you can find this out very easily on the internet, that you can be getting an income of £2,500 or £5,000 more pounds a year if you're on a sickness benefit, PIP and universal credit, rather than on the minimum wage. The fact is, and potentially with greater security of income without needing to go to work. So that is an incentive. Which if the alternative is the challenges of getting into work or staying into work, you can just see that the incentives go against people people working. So the incentives need to be fixed, and that's one reason why I've said we should stop giving people access to PIP for common mental health, low-level mental health problems, and bring back face-to-face assessments as well. It's not to say that you change incentives and you've immediately fixed the problem, but then instead you can use some of that money to actually give people the right support for whatever their challenges are, or in fact the many reasons why people, and particularly young people, where we're seeing this very rapid increase amongst young people going on to benefits, support for those people, young people, to overcome whatever it is that is proving them a challenge. So, and support while, for instance, being in work. And then the third thing I want to mention is jobs, where we are seeing a decrease in the number of vacancies and jobs available to people, and we're seeing a particular withdrawing of opportunities in the area which is often people's first jobs, whether that's things like in hospitality areas where it's the lower end of the pay scale, and those are the businesses that employers have been particularly hit by the national insurance rise, the jobs tax, and are really worrying about the impact of the Employment Rights Bill on them. And I've lost track of the number of employers who said to me, because of the extra employment costs, because of the Employment Rights Bill coming, we're just not going to take a risk on a young person. We're not going to take a risk on somebody who's got a health problem. We just can't take that risk. And so those opportunities are just not going to be there for people. And that is going to be a bigger and bigger problem, I think, in the months ahead.
Thank you, Helen. Fraser.
I think you asked what is causing the increase. Now, one of the big questions is the country simply getting sicker? Now, when you look at there are health surveys done, pretty big ones, and they show surprisingly flat levels of overall physical sickness in society. You cannot link the increase in sickness benefit to an increase in sickness in general. Also, Professor Simon Wesley, who's until recently the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, was saying that the same is true for the proper studies of mental health as well. Like, sure, a lot of people are getting antidepressants, but when you do the proper surveys trying to find out, is there genuinely a significant decrease in mental health, they don't show that increase either. So we're seeing a surge in claims, a surge in antidepressants, but we're not really seeing a surge in sickness. So what, therefore, is causing the staggering increase from 2.2 million people pre-pandemic in sickness benefit to 4 million people at the end of the Parliament? That is stunning. I mean, between now and the end of a decade, we're going to lose the equivalent of the working age population of Birmingham from the workforce, just to sickness benefit alone. Now, think of the hole that's going to leave in the economy. That'll have to be filled by immigration, with pressures on housing. I wouldn't need to tell you guys of all the terrible multiple problems this causes, not least for those affected. But the question as to why it's going up. This is incredibly complicated, but the OBR do very, very good work in general. They do a publication called Welfare Trends. One came out in October last year, I'm hoping one will come out around this year. And they looked at what was driving the increase. And they found that only a quarter of it was actually more claims, surprisingly enough. So if only a quarter of it is more claims, then what's the rest? 1/4 was more higher approval rates from the assessors, so they were more inclined to say yes to people. But the half of the increase was coming from something quite technical, a decrease in the dropout rate from making the first claim to actually going through with the interview. So what has happened was there was a sort of political pressure to make the process less difficult, less friction. But as any advocate of nudge theory will tell you, the easier something is, the more likely they're to go ahead with it. Now, it's one of the big changes as well was a switch during the pandemic from face-to-face interviews to telephone interviews. So previously, almost everybody had to go in and meet somebody to say, I'm too sick to work, I'm too depressed to work. Now, it's quite possible that that's quite a big step to take if you're not really, that people might balk at the final interview and just drop out of the process. But when it was a simple phone call, when you actually knew what questions were going to be asked and what to say, because if you can go online, these so-called sickfluencers can coach you through one of these things. That process is far less intimidating and therefore easier to game. So it seems that it's a very big example, actually, of how a relatively small change in government technology made a massive change in outcome. So the reduction in the drop-off rate from applicants to actually showing up to the interview is responsible for half of the increase. That's according to the OBR. The final point of this, of course, is off-flow. Reassessments used to happen a lot. under IDS, I think there was huge numbers. I mean, tens of thousands being taken off sickness benefits and moved into work every quarter. They stopped completely during lockdown, and they never really restarted. I met somebody last year who was a taxi driver in Brighton, and he was on sickness benefits, and he got better. And he called the department saying, look, I don't need this benefit anymore. I'm better. And they said, sorry, you need to wait for your reassessment. And he was like, when's that going to be? That was 3 years ago. So I spoke to him for my film. You know, he was an incredible case study. We actually, when we came across him, we almost didn't believe it. And so he was able to show us the emails, how he tried to contact them. Please, I did have a heart issue, but I'm better now. I want to work. I don't want to sit here and take your benefits. Release me from this trap. And he was just getting nothing. And eventually he gave up. But he was telling me that there was no economic incentive at all for him to do this. He was doing this because he was an honest man who didn't want to take sickness benefit. He didn't believe in it. But the system wouldn't let him go. So that is the sort of problems that we're dealing with right now. But while it's depressing, I tell you what's optimistic about it. If system failures created this surge, then system improvements can make a lot of things better. You don't need to pass a law to change the work capability assessment. You don't need to pass a law to basically get this process right. So if the government genuinely wants to try to make things better, it can start reassessments back to the level that IDS was doing them. It can also make face-to-face assessments routine. That's part of Helen's strategy now. I mean, even if you don't have the money to do it, you could tell the applicant they're going to be routine until the last minute, just to basically, that's a good filtering to make sure you do see those who are genuinely too sick. So there's a lot that can be done, but this is a case study in how the way that we change this very complicated system, which very few people understand, can lead to results which are just stunning. But I'm very pleased now they're beginning to become widely understood. I mean, as some of you might know, but at the end of the last government, there 2,000 people every working day were being written off into sickness benefit. You imagine what that looks like. And the new figures came out last week. They show it's now 5,000 a day. So that's like losing the whole of the O2 centre every 4 days. It's difficult. And by the way, imagine this multiplied by X many years. And it's a crazy way of running a society and an economy. It doesn't make sense for anybody.
Thank you, Fraser. And Jimmy, your thoughts on the same question?
Well, so I think on the job side, there are 5 things that are happening that are decreasing the amount of vacancies that are in the economy. So you've got the national minimum wage, which has particularly been hiked for 18-year-olds as well. You have the national insurance rise as mentioned. You've got the employment rights. You've then also got the kind of geopolitical situation as well with tariffs and so on, and businesses not knowing where that's necessarily going to land, whether they're going to be hit next year, etc. And then you've also got AI going through the system, which is beginning to do a lot of the entry-level style work that could be done. So when you're sitting there as a business leader and you've got these 5 things on your radar, you are just not incentivized to take that risk and hire people the following year because you just don't know the situation that's going to be there. And I think that the left sometimes they measure a lot of things in terms of the public sector, in terms of headcount. It's sort of the big status when you're in government. How big is your team? How big's the empire you're creating? And I don't think they realise necessarily that in the private sector, people are not necessarily incentivised to take more people on. And I think you're beginning to see a big sort of shift in that in terms of a lot of it used to be in my particular world of entrepreneurship and raising capital, etc. Like the 2 big things were how much money you've raised and what is from which investors and what is your headcount. Now it's sort of the flipping is happening where it's like people are demonstrating how much more they can do with less people. And that I think is a really worrying thing. And I think it's a cultural thing that we need to kind of stand up for job creators, etc. We need a bit more of the kind of like American enterprise becoming part of the culture of our fabric, because that is what is going to create the jobs, which is going to allow people to escape the welfare trap.
Thank you. So it seems clear to me there's 2 broad sets of factors emerging from this conversation. The one is the system failures in the welfare state, and the other seems to be that it's just much harder to create jobs now and is going to get even harder. I wonder what the panelists think is the main explanation for one of the sub-trends within economic inactivity and rising inactivity. For years and decades now, we've seen more women entering the workforce, that long-term trend, and yet in the main driver of people leaving the workforce seems to be men, and particularly young men. What factors explain that difference? Would anyone like to have a go?
It could be somebody else first.
Helen, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm partly pausing because I'm trying to think. There was some recent data, and I'm trying to remember what it was to do with the difference of what's going on with young men and young women. And I think the most recent data was that the situation was worsening amongst young women being in the proportion, particularly in the younger 18 to 25-year-olds. But it's somewhere back in my head that I'm trying to pull it out from. But I'll tell you something, and it's actually, and it's slightly counterintuitive compared to the overall story. That might be my hair. The overall story of it being harder to get into work and the reduction in job vacancies, and I have many conversations with people who are really struggling to, young people struggling to get into work. But on the other hand, and apologies for any of you who heard my main stage speech yesterday in which I referred to Pickering's lifts, but to me it was an interesting anecdote relating to the young men question. Pickering's Lifts is a business in Stockton-on-Tees that installs lifts, and they have lots of lift engineers. And they recruit people pretty much straight out of school if you want to. They do an apprenticeship. You get all the training you need on the job. By the time you're 30, you can be earning about £50,000. Pretty good job. They're a good employer. Those jobs tend to appeal, the reality is, more to men than women. They do have women as lift engineers, and they're encouraging women to do it. But the reality is, it's often the kind of job that you think is the kind of thing that many a young man might seem to be the sort of thing they want to do. And one of the things I've heard in many conversations, again, about job opportunities is, well, the jobs out there, they're in social care, or they're call centres, they're gig economy, they're not sort of things they want to do, people want to do. Yet here you have an employer offering exactly the sort of jobs and apprenticeships that you would think might be very appealing for young people, I'd say young men, to do. Yet, I think it's around 25 of their apprenticeship posts are currently unfilled. They can't get enough applicants for those apprenticeships, even though that business is in an area of very high unemployment. And in Stockton-on-Tees, the town that they're in, there are around 5,000 people who are unemployed. And down the road from this business is an estate which was featured in the Benefit Street documentary, in around 2014, but still has very high levels of unemployment. And the question is, why aren't people going from that estate to go and do these jobs? And from the discussions I've been having, and at the root of it is why I started off on the incentives point, and in part the incentives just aren't there to get into work. I guess to take the conversation beyond that, the other thing is a cultural one, where if you have families and generations where nobody has worked for a long time, nobody is in work, then it is that much harder to be the person in the household, particularly if neither of your parents have worked, to be the one who goes out and works. And one of the interesting questions is, how do you change that that cultural thing around? It's not just incentives, but what is the equivalent of me saying to my kids, you will go and do a holiday job, and after 3 or 4 days to my son fruit picking when he said, oh, Mum, can I not go to work anymore? I'm like, no, you are going. But what is the equivalent of that for people who have been brought up in a non-working household to get to work and stay in work? That is another question to answer.
Absolutely. Fraser, did you notice any particular difference in terms of gender in your researches for the documentary?
I didn't, actually. There are various dynamics there. I mean, for a long time it was typically young men. Deindustrialisation was associated with welfare reform, but I've spoken to work capability assessment assessors who say they noticed a large increase in young women. We're talking who go straight from university onto incapacity benefit. And she was saying it was depressing when you think about just, given you're very unlikely to ever to come off sickness benefit when you go on it. And she was telling me that was the hardest part of her job as an assessor. The other part she was saying was talking to an alcoholic who she knew she had to sign off, but when she absolutely knew what would happen if you give the alcoholic money. I mean, the number of alcoholic-related deaths we've seen have been huge. I think they're up 50%. since the pandemic. And we've got this terribly sort of callous system now where where you can sign up for extra, what do we think an alcoholic's going to do with extra money and no support? And it's absolutely dreadful. It's claiming lives. Now, and with women, of course, the benefit system you talk about, for a standard incapacity benefit plus PIP, most of them get PIP, it's about 22 grand, which is versus 20 grand on the minimum wage after tax. But if there's a child, a mother and a child, it gets significantly more. Second child, even more than that. If the kid is registered as disabled, which is not impossible to do nowadays, it's even more. We're talking more than the average worker, let alone the and the mutability, etc. So that is something which the dynamics there obviously are more prevalent for single mothers than single fathers. When I was doing the case studies, I actually didn't produce some of the figures because they just look. I'm not quite sure how many people are in that condition, but I did speak to a single mum there, and in this very tough council estate, and she was telling me that she was from a very broken family herself. She had to leave school. Was at home when she was like 13, and she was trying desperately to give her son the kind of stability which she never had. Now, in the environment where she was, when you looked at that neighbourhood, about all the criminality and the drug abuse all around her, she's trying to make her home into this kind of oasis of stability. And if she were to go out to do the minimum wage work, very insecure, very difficult, have to leave her kid behind for quite a while, I'm not quite sure how that would be better for the kid. My point was that quite often we can sit in conferences like this and say, okay, this is terrible, we're going to cut their benefits, etc. But when you actually come out to the person itself, would our society be better if Amy would somehow had that support pulled from her? I'm not quite sure you could. It made me think that I think you need to grandfather these benefits and try to get things better for those coming in the system. My point was, in her situation, would I have taken a different decision? I'm not sure I would have done. What was best for her kid? What was best to stop her kids going down the same sort of cycle of neglect that she suffered as a young kid? I think she made the right decision. My point being that we must never succumb to the temptation of thinking these people are lazy or scroungers or the rest of it. The opinion polls will tell you that. But what they're doing is walking down a path the government lays for them. If that path leads to work, as it did for me, you'll go down to work. It's a logical thing to do. But if you come out of these places, you're not really educated properly, and that path leads to welfare dependency. And if you want to go to work, fair enough, but you'll be poorer, you'll be less secure, your family more at risk. These incentives is a message which the government sends to the public. And in my view, there's a moral failure here. It's a failure to look at the way these things are constructed at the top, rather than the moral failure of those who are simply responding, as all the rest of us are, to the various incentives laid in front of us. You play the hand you're dealt, and millions of people in this country are being dealt a terrible hand.
So you can look at this at a macro or micro level, and one of the changes that brought in was to trying to work very locally in DWP, like job centre by job centre, trying to understand what was happening. There was actually quite a lot of resistance, partly because you see this, by the way, in health. DWP wasn't particularly set up by that. It was, I don't know if it was a culture thing or they just struggled. But going into that kind of very personal approach actually enabled us to unveil what was good practice and try and share that elsewhere, whereas too often, not atypical for the public sector, sometimes those who shouted the loudest seem to get the most rewards. But where I'm heading with this is clearly getting people into work and making it as easy as possible for people to get into work. We've already heard about the incentives for employers to take people on. And we know that Labour is making a complete dog's breakfast of this. It's truly depressing how bad they have been. Labour just isn't working in every way. But there are still difficulties which we did not properly tackle, to my frustration, on things like childcare. Now, we, I think as a country, are now spending £8 billion a year on childcare. In the hands of the DFE, which is where it really was, their only system, and we've seen it accelerate under Labour, is to put everything around aspects of nurseries linked to schools, and for childcare to be, in effect, a preschool approach, as opposed to being responsive to what parents need. in terms of looking after their childcare, for their child to be safe, putting everything under Ofsted, all that approach, the early years scheme, it's been slightly reduced in that. And of course there are benefits for children to be able to do that. But my constituency, where I used to represent, a lot of the jobs for people who really could earn more, they were in the summer holidays. It was a tourism destination. That's when childcare was not available. You know, the 30 hours a week is a myth. It's 30 hours a week if you do it on school weeks, not on 52 weeks a year. And yet, I did fail in this internally within the government of trying to get these little fingers of DFE after childcare to just be about how to have preschool education. It was a huge frustration. The number of childminders collapsed. And we added regulation upon regulation. We started to take a few away, but we never properly tackled it. So if nothing else, I'm hoping that you and Laura can properly sort this out. My fear is that the education blob get a whole grip of this, rip it away from Ofsted, put it back in the hands of, frankly, local authorities to be checking whether children are safe or not. That's their statutory duty already. But most importantly of all, listen to parents who already can tell MPs, can already tell people here, they can't really afford to go to work. They earn less than it would be. And that is the sort of systematic change which I will hold my hands up in my time in that aspect of government I failed to address. We got somewhere by giving a bit more money to the people where you can get it from 9 months, and that has come in. But that's when the average for 9 months upwards, the average across the country was £260 a week that parents would have to pay on childcare, and they got zero support for it. So if we are going to help people get into work, that's the sort of thing I think we need to do more detailed aspects on. That's not necessarily the same as the welfare trap, but it is a way to try and open up people's prosperity. And the other angle, I know people in the room who've worked with me on this, is it's astonishing how many people who are eligible to pay child maintenance don't work. And that is another focus we should get. Because ultimately, you're absolutely right, Fraser, people aren't, I'm sure we've all met somebody who we think is pulling whatever.
Right, yeah.
But actually, vast people don't actually have that enjoyable a life on benefits. It's not designed to. And there is that element of people not fulfilling their potential is actually very demotivating for them. But nevertheless, the incentives guide you down a particular path, which is why doing this level of detail while we're in opposition, I think, is very helpful, not only just for the prosperity of our country, but for the genuine, frankly, happiness of our country. And there's a lot to be said in terms of our social benefits, societal benefits of doing these policies right, not just the economics. So that's where I hope I can contribute some of my thinking in the next few years as well.
Jimmy?
It was more, you asked a question about boys, particularly. I think, whilst it's not a gender point, I do think that, touching on what Fraser's saying, is that we do need to have some empathy with young people. I think being in your 20s, in the 2020s, is quite difficult, and there's lots of sort of influences that are kind of being like thrown at them. They also had like a pretty torrid time in the pandemic as well, and I just think adolescence is somewhat extending as we all kind of live longer and so on. And there is also now the pressure of, they often can see people that have been very successful in their 20s, the likes of Stephen Bartlett and Ben Francis, the founder of Gymshark, and it can just lead to this sort of feeling of being kind of like left behind in the sort of race of life. And I think it's just important that we kind of empathise with them in terms of just how challenging it is, because in a way there's never been more opportunity out there. There's never been more interesting jobs that are out there. But trying to navigate that in the modern world, I think, is harder than it's ever been. So I do think that's something that we need to bear in mind as well.
When it comes down to numbers as well, by the way, the other growing problem, which some work has been done on, but is the amount of money we spend on housing. So there's over £30 billion a year spent on housing benefit. That is growing. Fewer and fewer pensioners own their own home. So we will be starting to see lifelong dependency on taxpayers to help pay for somewhere to live. So that is another issue we need to tackle too.
Mm-hmm.
It all sounds a bit depressing, but the great news is that we did it when we were in government.
Yeah.
We also had problems in government. There's no doubt the COVID. I'm slightly surprised about the guy not being able to come off benefits, because you're supposed to apply every 3 years, depending on how long you've been signed off for, but in order to keep that benefit going. But nevertheless, it sounds like there's good opportunities in a conservative, considerate, compassionate way. And,
the other great thing is discussions like this are happening more often. I mean, I'm really encouraged that the hall is as full as it is. I mean, I know as a journalist, when I wrote about this, it was the least popular subject. When I first became editor of A Spectator, I led the magazine on welfare, and the sales absolutely tanked. It did. It was terrible. I've actually got that framed in my obviously as an example of how not to do it. Oh, God, this is the most important thing today. No, but there is always something more exciting, right? Than talking about the miserable life of. But I think for a long time I thought that we were kind of losing sight of each other as a society. That the lives of these people were becoming so distinct from that there was a kind of social apartheid between the working and the workless, and that the newspapers, etc., were bought by the working. And like what was happening in Gaza was of huge pertinence, interest, and yet what was happening in Blackpool might as well have been happening on the dark side of the moon. I think that is now changing. And also, I think it's great now I was quite critical of some of the things that the Conservatives did in welfare, but there weren't any Labour people saying that. To have an opposition which is now on the case is a big, big difference. Because if nobody's really looking at this, there is a terra incognita here. There are so many rocks to lift and see what's happening under. There are so many ways in which the system is going wrong. If there is scrutiny, if there is interest, if there are people like you coming to conversations like this, then we can start to apply political pressure, apply interest. I mean, politicians, I know as being a journalist, will only respond if there is political pressure. That is just political physics. That's the laws of political physics. And if there is absolutely no pressure to do something which is very difficult, then you can't really expect a politician to do that. Again, you can go on one of these missions if you want to, but you will get lots of opposition from number 10 who would say, maybe don't do this, maybe let's just forget about them. But the more interest and pressure and discussions, and you're right, it is depressing, right? But there is no more depressing topic than what we're doing to the poorest people in our society. But hopefully, out of this will come desire for change and some pressure. And out of that pressure can come reform.
I think another note of optimism, and along with an opposition being on the case, which I'll take. And this is also something, Fraser, you've said, but I think it as well, is actually if we can turn this around, not only do you save a huge amount of money and hopefully stop the government having to put up so much taxes so much and the economic doom loop that follows from that, or if we do it in government, avoid an economic doom loop. But also, actually, the untapped potential of many hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are currently not in work and could be contributing to our economy. So instead of claiming benefits, contributing of their energy and their efforts, not only clearly that you get taxes out of that, but actually just to the productivity of the country. And every so often, out of more people working, you'll get somebody who will be entrepreneurial, who start a business, who will create opportunity, who will do something which results in us exporting, which will be employing lots of people. Like, out of that, greater growth will come. So actually, I think turning this around, it should be something that we could be hugely excited about economically as well. And that is an optimistic angle on the conversation.
I think that's a really good note to pause the discussion on. I'm conscious of the time, so we're going to open it up to questions from the floor.
Gosh.
Wow, excellent. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. Please try and keep them brief. So we'll just start at the front, this gentleman here.
Thank you. Question to Fraser. Was any conversations like this happening last week in Liverpool? Were you there? And also, how do we compare internationally, speaking of European countries? Are they having similar problems?
One, there weren't. I know there's a long, proud history of Labour reformers, Frank Field, James Purnell, etc. Their successors are not visible right now. I think Liz Kendall was a brave woman whose heart was in the right place, but she was not given support by the Treasury, who told her to save money rather than save lives, and number 10 just wasn't up for it. They botched it. I don't mean this in a party political point, but it is deeply controversial in Labour circles to talk about welfare consumption being a problem. They're very keen to say, it's because everybody's sick, or, it is seen they regard it, broadly speaking, as a sort of a wicked, cruel, right-wing agenda to save money. And so it is very difficult. I've never worked out why, because to me it's obvious. If I was a progressive, this would be number one on my list of priorities. I actually do regard myself as a progressive, and it is on my number one list of priorities. But I can't see why this can't be a left-wing cause as well as a right-wing one. But in answer to your question, no, I didn't, and I still haven't. If you can go to the Labour backbenchers and not hear a single peep. I mean, to be honest, even in opposition, they didn't really care that much. When the number of people in out-of-work benefits went through 6 million, you'd expect a Labour opposition to say to the Tories, look at this, 3 million under Thatcher, 6 million under Sunak. You know, they could have really gone for it, but they didn't. Because there's something which just isn't, the wiring isn't there. On my website, I've got, I collect welfare data, some of you might know. I also look at this compared to other countries. Most of them is going down, right? This is the thing. We are the only country in the Western world to have anything approaching this problem. In Australia, Austria, Sweden, a sickness benefit is going down. So if I can make I'm hoping Channel 4 will commission me to make another one about the solutions, where I would go to various countries and find out how they managed to turn this around. We're not talking about splitting the atom here. We're about doing something which happened before under Ian Duncan Smith, happened under James Purnell. And actually, the title of the book on welfare reform by a guy called Lawrence Mead about Wisconsin, the title of that book is Government Works. It's strange, but the point there is government can turn this around. It is in our hands.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Just one thing on the young males not applying for jobs. At my son's school, I found that they had a formal curriculum for girls' careers. Every month there would be someone about manufacturing, fashion, retail. Obviously, there was a girls-only computer club. Nothing for boys. And I fished around. This has become quite common. Careers are aimed at girls. Also, I worked for some years as a headhunter, and I've had HR people say to my face, we do not want to hire people like you, because I'm male and over 50. We are creating, and if you said that about women, they would sack you, sack your boss, and then sack anyone who happened to sit next to you. But you do it with men, you do it with young boys, and you get away with it, and you win awards. Because you go to diversity conferences, and I've heard senior people say, we will only hire women in tech jobs until we get, and we're breeding reform, because these young men have become radicalised. It's not just that they're dependent, they're radicalised and dependent. So what are we going to do about that?
I can take that on.
Well, I could, but I'll let other people.
I just think it might be worth considering a different strand of...
Can you answer it without saying we need to give more things to women? Because this conversation degenerated into how do we give them things to women?
Any employer will take the best candidate for the job, end of. So that's it.
You've not dealt with HR professionally, have you?
You don't need to patronise me, sir. I think there's a few things where we can also look as a government, as a state, about how we've changed the qualification levels to get into certain professions. You're supposed to have a degree or take on a degree apprenticeship to become a police officer. This was done to try and tackle a perceived or a real issue that police officers were attracting the wrong kind of person, and having a higher level of education would eradicate some of the problems that we are seeing very much in police forces right across the country. I don't believe that. I believe that was some kind of theory. I cannot actually see it's made any difference whatsoever. What it's done is put people off again, sort of different processes or jobs that were more straightforward for them to access. People leaving the armed forces can't get in to become a police officer. So they end up becoming security officers, working for G4S, because they haven't got the degree. And they don't, at the age of 28, coming out of the army, want to start on some degree apprenticeship. So we've got to get rid of a lot of the crap, frankly, which is stopping access to real jobs that need filling by good quality people who've already had good life experiences. So I think there's an element there that, again, some of this is getting rid of some detailed work. It was a campaign by the Royal College for Nursing to require all nurses to have degrees. The NHS has built this in as well, in a variety of ways. And what it's doing is people are having to rack up more debts to get the degrees, And then that is obviously leading to a drive and demand for much higher earnings. Now, we took a philosophical decision a few years ago to try and make our wage 66% of median earnings. Part of the reason for doing that was to artificially make sure, basically, if you work full-time on the minimum wage, technically you cannot be considered in poverty statistics to be poor, because it's 60% is the threshold. So we've designed into our systems certain things in order to artificially tackle certain statistics we've set ourselves. Now, given that Kemi's at the process, and quite likely with her team, of stripping away, frankly, a lot of crap, I'd like us to go back to basics on some of this stuff and see what is real. What is real about things like who's poverty and all these different elements? Because I tell you, some of these policies are driving really odd decisions in actually how we help people get on. So I appreciate it's got not a lot to do with your answer, but I don't see particularly employers discriminating on the basis of that. I think they are going for the people who've got the aptitude that they want to see. And that's, for me, is not just about, clearly it's not a man-woman thing, but how employers see their workforces developing and also complementing their existing experience that they've got.
Helen, did you?
Two things on that. One is to do with boys who, for instance, drop out of school because they feel education isn't for them. And at the moment, we have a problem of, for instance, in the 16 to 18 age bracket, when you're meant to be in full-time education, and maybe drop out of school and then you end up doing nothing, and then by the time you get to 18, you're way less employable, and you end up just like signing on to benefits and never getting in a path to work. And I think that is a disaster. And I think we have to look at, and it's girls as well, but there, you know, there's the, I remember meeting a few months ago a 16-year-old lad in my constituency. It was midweek and he was at home, and why wasn't he at school? He doesn't want to go to school. What he wants to do is work in his dad's business, which is a fencing business, but his dad's not allowed to have him as an apprentice because of the way our apprenticeship system isn't flexible enough for him to do that. Like, it was one example, but the sort of thing that can be repeated all around, that we haven't got enabling a route for people who don't want to be going full-time to school at that age, who actually want to get on and be working, and then could be still, you know, doing numeracy, literacy and things like that alongside. So I think there's something around the education and connection to careers for teenagers for whom full-time school is not the answer. The other thing, and it's related to this, so bear with me, it's one of the organisations I visited recently, helps people with a criminal conviction into work, because that can be very, very hard. And 12.5 million people of working age, they told me, have a criminal conviction of some kind. And there are a lot of employers who, as a basic part of their recruitment process, you know, tick a box, have you got a conviction? And if you've got a conviction, you're not even going to be considered, and you're immediately, you know, funneled out of that opportunity. So there is something on the employment side to try and have opportunities open to people, even if they have at some point in their life gone wrong in some way, and to actually give people another chance of going in the right direction and paying their own way when they want to.
I'll take another two questions. So, gentleman back over there, and the lady over here in the middle.
Just on employment law, to make it easier, is it best to maybe look at working with small businesses to redesign employment law to make it easier for employers to employ people? And should we look at maybe doing work placements with like people on like universal credit to get them into work?
Okay, so employment law and...
Hello, my name is Neil Guzelgun and I'm from Mind, the mental health charity. I'd like to come to the point around incentives and incentives for employers to make workplaces more inclusive for people with mental health problems, and what your view is on reviewing those incentives.
Jimmy, would you like to come in on employment law and job creation?
it's always great to engage with small business, right? But running a small business, like actually engaging with government, is not at the kind of like top of your sort of to-do list quite often, because you've got so much else that you're trying to sort of deal with. So in principle, yes, you know, great to kind of engage with small business, etc. But it's just from a practical point of view, having sat in number 10 trying to do this, obviously you kind of reach out to the FSB and so on and do quite a lot of that. But it is a real challenge on that for small business to kind of get their voice heard. But it comes back to the point I was making earlier, I think, about culturally, like if we could get every small business to employ one more person, like we would eradicate a lot of this problem. And so I think it comes back to that cultural bit about sort of standing up for job creators and making them feel much better and much more supportive. Go on.
I think I was just probably staring into the distance. Don't please.
Okay.
Keep going.
Conference
Keep
does this
going. And these ladies spotted something in my face. And that was all. Keep going. Don't mind me.
Don't do that to Kemi.
No, someone else go, because that's what the second question was.
Mental health and the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think employers have become much more aware of it, and at the end of the day, you want to access the best talent. I know it's kind of World Dyslexia Day tomorrow as well, which I think is a really important point, because actually these people have, you know, kind of skills and assets that you don't appreciate, and if you can utilise them, it's like one of my favourite things about GCHQ is the amount of people that they employ with that, and they go out and specifically look for them. So I think that's quite interesting. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm dyslexic myself, right? I'm not sort of like so. Okay. Well,
right. I think your point about, I don't think it's employment law so much as incentives. I mean, Helen was talking about how she works with a charity that makes it easier for ex-cons to get into the workplace. We know that Lord Timpson, now a Labour peer, who did a lot of that in Timpson's. I think something similar should be done for long-term unemployed. I think that employers should be given a significant incentive. If you manage to get somebody who's basically been unemployed for a year and keep them in a job for a year, then you've saved the taxpayer I don't know how much money, and that deserves to be recognised. So I think this really should be recognised, that the best way out for health, wealth, everything is to get back in the workplace. And an employer, big or small, who does that is doing God's work. And it can only really come from employers. And I think when you think about the money that can be saved to the taxpayer, crudely put, in getting somebody long-term unemployed back to work, and give an employer, say, 10% of that, whatever that lump sum is going to be, that could be a significant incentive. And on mental health, I think I've got my own quite passionate personal views about this, but I think it's all, not everybody can work 9 to 5 in a straight way. You can work with people who've got, who are different places, have different needs and reactions. You need to be more flexible as an employer. A lot of employers aren't flexible. They've just got their fixed thing. Either you can be here X many days a week, or you're off sick, and after that you're out completely. Now, what would inspire an employer to go the extra mile to meet the extra person? It has to be workforce shortage. Now, this is perhaps a controversial point here, but I think the major problem we've had in the last 15 years is that we have not had enough workforce shortage, because we've had a world of very highly skilled talent coming in from Europe. And mass migration has, I think, has worked very well, but it's worked too well. It's worked so well that employers have just pressed that button and had these perfect workers coming in, usually overskilled for the position, and grown the company that way. Now, if they didn't have that, then they would be forced to go deeper into the community and be more flexible. When I started off as a journalist in the mid-90s, I wrote a story about a bus company that needed drivers so much, it was going into basically drunk houses, drying out drunks and training them up, and it seemed to be a scandal at the time. But I saw it the other way around. I thought, isn't that how a free market is supposed to work? The company needs people. It's going there, it's being open-minded, it's seeing how it can engage in healthcare and stuff. So I think that, And now that's almost like from another era. You'd never think about that now. You get the care homes that are saying, nobody wants these jobs, so give us more immigrants to fill them, rather than government saying, no, you need to be more flexible, you need to pay more. If you're paying a care house worker less than a supermarket shelf stacker, you need to pay more. My point is, employers need to go the extra mile, but they will not do so unless they're forced. And that is why I think that the post-Brexit opportunity to constrain immigration supply and bring about that change was squandered with calamitous consequences. I think it's going to have to be brought back one way or another.
Pick up on those two things. I'm sure you want to fit in some more questions. But I mean, I'm very interested in how we would make it worthwhile for employers to employ people who have been unemployed for longer and young people who have been really struggling to get into work. What I do know is it's definitely not increasing the risk on employing somebody, making it less likely that employers will take a risk to employ somebody, take a chance, and making it more expensive to employ people. All of those things that the government is doing is going in the wrong direction from there being an opportunity for somebody who doesn't have a track record in work to be in work. And so I think it's I'm looking at how you turn that around and the extent to which it's about government getting out of the way of businesses or actually turning it around and really helping it make it worthwhile for businesses to employ people who are harder to employ. On the mental health side, and I think it's a two-way thing. On the one hand, employers need to get better about understanding mental health. I think a huge amount of progress has been made. And I remember in 2015, when I was first a Member of Parliament, I worked a lot with Mind and Rethink on what can we do to raise awareness about mental health and mental health first aiders and things like that. And I think many employers have got much, much better at understanding the mental health needs of their staff, others further to go. But it has to be hand in hand with the whole concept of if you're struggling with your mental health, it's not a reason to not go to work, to drop out of work, to go to the GP to get a sick note and to get onto benefits. So I think it's both sides of that. Is one, you can't have the route which is just like, okay, I have a mental health struggle, not going to be working anymore, and the other is for the employer to be understanding and supportive. And I think it has to be like both sides of those. You can't just point your finger at the employer or point your finger at the individual. It's both sides have got to do their bit.
On employment law, one of our first acts has to be, when we're back in government, is to repeal the dreadful employment rights bill. That will make it straightforward. I agree with what's been said. By the way, Boris set the challenge about doubling the number of prisoners leaving when they leave prison to get into work within 6 months, and we achieved that. And it happened because Dominic Raab basically told the governors that was going to be one of their key performance measures. And it worked. So it started to transform. We started to get seeing businesses coming in, and James Timpson was involved. It's a shame he's so ungracious about it now, but when he speaks criticising our party in that regard. On terms of mental health, I am interested in this proposal about the whatever they're calling it, Future Jobs Fund. We did it with Kickstart during COVID, of helping young people get that job and paying employers to do it, as well as some wraparound. I can see I haven't looked at it in detail, but I can see something beneficial there where the state does pay for the salary of somebody being taken on in work. But it's got to be a mutual commitment, a mutual benefit, and have that commitment that people will honour what they're going to do or consequences if they can't. I always believe having this hand in hand with support. And what you're starting to see in the world of work, many more managers are experiencing a friend, a relative who is going through similar difficulties, and it's making them think about how can they do some slight modifications to their world of work to be more accommodating for people going through this without it being seen as a difficulty and an inconvenience. And that for me is a positive change, even if not every shareholder likes it. But ultimately, we have to look after each other through this. And I think the accommodation that's been referred to is necessary, particularly at this challenging time for a lot of youngsters, as Jimmy pointed out eloquently about their recent experiences.
Well, I'm very sorry because we are out of time now. Could you please join me in thanking our panellists for some fantastic.